Good morning, everyone. Welcome to church today, and especially if you're a visitor with us, welcome to you. And I hope that you're able to stay and have some fellowship with us after the service and just maybe meet a few people that you don't know. And if you're a local, make sure you talk to someone perhaps you haven't spoken to before so that we can enjoy each other's fellowship. We've had a series started this term on mentoring. And one of the reasons we started that series was because some of our young adults, I suppose, highlighted the fact that they needed support and they needed role models, and we could lift our game as a church in doing that. So we've started this series on mentoring, and we're really highlighting the value of mentoring, or another word for it is discipleship. And we're encouraging people to find someone, either younger or older than yourself, that you can connect with and maybe meet with regularly, and just support one another in our walk with Christ. And one of the scriptures that we started with in this series was John chapter 15, where Jesus says, "I am the vine and you are the branches." And we've been looking at, I've had this lily-pilly tree as a visual aid to help us. So Jesus is the vine, that middle part, that's where we get our life from. And we, the body of Christ, are the branches. And the branches don't have life of themselves, they get their life from the vine, but we support one another and we help one another. And there's protection and shade, and there's support in being a branch. And the branches really represent the body of Christ, the local church. And God provides us with this relationship with his son Jesus through the cross, through forgiveness and salvation. But once we become connected to Jesus, then we become one of the branches. And so some of the more established branches can help some of the younger branches, and that's really what mentoring is. So we looked at a few different examples of mentoring in the Bible, and we started with Jesus and Peter because Jesus is the only perfect example of a mentor. And then we moved on and looked at Moses and Joshua. Last week Sandra Lee preached on Naomi and Ruth, and all these messages are on our website if you want to have a look at them. And today we're going to look at Eli and Samuel. Now, Phil, I have preached messages on this passage before, looking very much at the call of God on someone's life, and Samuel is a great example of that. But I suppose I want to take a slightly different angle this week and look at Eli's role in Samuel's life as Samuel's mentor. Now, Eli was an old man. He was a priest in the house of God, and this is during the time of the judges, before Israel had kings. And so Eli was like the chief priest, and he lived at the house of God, and he was a judge for Israel. He had two sons, and those sons were out of control, basically. They were supposed to be priests, but they were immoral, they were dishonest, they were a disgrace. And in the passage that Carol read to us, the house of Eli was to be judged because of the conduct of Eli's sons. So Eli as a father did a pretty ordinary job. He probably didn't have the right boundaries in place for his sons early on, and they basically did their own thing and ended up not walking with God. So here we have this old man, Eli. It says that his eyesight was poor, his mobility was limited. He was probably about 80 years old, we think, when Samuel arrived at the house of God. Samuel was the son of Hannah. Hannah, you'll remember if you know the story in 1 Samuel, prayed for a child. She was barren. And she came to the house of God annually, and she prayed that God would give her a child. And she said, "God, if you give me a child, I'll give the child back to you." So God answered her prayer, and she had this little boy, Samuel. And it says that when Samuel was weaned, he was taken to the house of God by his mother Hannah and given back to the Lord. Now, we can speculate on how old weaned is, but let's say somewhere between 2 and 4 years old. Maybe older, but not very old. So you've got this old 80-year-old man who'd done a really poor job as a dad, and this 2, maybe 3, 4-year-old little boy arrives, and there's no indication that Eli had a wife. There's no indication that there was anyone else available to look after this little boy except this old, decrepit man, right? And you think, how is that going to work? I want to show you a little clip from a series that's been on the ABC recently, and I've only seen one episode, but it just brought a smile to my face. And if you haven't seen it, you can find it on iView, but it's called Old People's Home for 4-Year-Olds. We're just going to watch a 2-minute clip from that series.
For the elderly, home can be a lonely place.
I have no family here. I'm basically on my own.
Now, a life-changing social experiment returns.
Hi! Hello! The old people!
Bringing together new young folk.
Yay!
Some old people don't know how to dance.
And new old folk.
I have no idea what's on my head.
And I've got no preconceived ideas how to treat a 4-year-old.
What's your name? I'll forget it in a minute.
To improve the lives of everyone involved.
Any older person that wants to teach my daughter some discipline is fantastic.
We can't reverse old age, but we can reverse frailty.
It's really good to see her starting to make some new friendships.
I feel a little bit scared.
Don't be scared, I'm here. I wasn't crazy about participating.
We didn't give them antidepressants. We gave them interaction with children.
Let me see where it takes me.
Go, 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 go. Hard, and relax.
I just feel like my first day at school.
Staying mentally active can improve brain function.
How do you remember all that?
Get ready to laugh and cry all over again.
That's called a turkey neck.
I just farted! George, you have to move more.
Move any more or fall over.
I'm getting quite emotional. I will remember today for a long time.
How old is old?
I think 20.
I'm really needing the love that a young one gives.
I feel like you're part of our life already.
I had so much fun.
We're almost there.
Together, we're stronger than we are alone.
The new season of Old People's Home for 4-Year-Olds. Tuesday, April 6th at 8:30 on ABC TV and streaming on iView.
Has anyone seen that? Yeah. Notice the smiles on everyone's faces. Smiles on the children's faces, smiles on the old people's faces, smiles on the parents' faces. Why is that? Because I think it's what God intended. If you went back maybe a couple of generations, you would have had extended family living together. You would have had old granny or pa in the corner with a rug over their knees, and little children running around, and no doubt curious, running up to granny or pa and wanting to sit on their knee and wanting just to find out about who this old person is. And so very naturally you have that connection. And as you can see there, 4-year-olds and 85-year-olds really connect well. And there's something good about that, and there's something godly about that. And I can imagine that that's what would have happened for Eli and Samuel. Now, that they would have had their moments. 4-year-olds take a bit of looking after, and Eli would have no doubt felt tired a lot of the time, and wondering, have I got the energy for this? And yet we can be confident that Eli did a much better job of raising Samuel than what Eli did of raising his own sons, because Samuel grew up to be a great prophet of God, and he knew God. He was well raised. It got me thinking about old people in my life that have had an impact on me. And I want you to think about that too. I want you to think maybe about grandparents or someone who's had an impact on your life looking back. And for me, that person was my grandfather, and I want to show you a picture of him. Now, some people say we look alike, and that could be more and more true. but that's at his 80th birthday. His name was Arthur, and he was born at Port Campbell in 1905, the son of dairy farmers, and he was an only child. And he grew up with his mum and his dad on this dairy farm in the early 1900s at Port Campbell. Would have been pretty tough going. When his dad was 42 years old and the First World War was nearing its completion, his dad, who had been to the Boer War in the 1890s, decided that he should enlist in the army. And he went off overseas as a 42-year-old to the Middle East, and he didn't come back. He was killed there. So here we have this boy who's 13 or 14 years old with his mum and no other help left to run a dairy farm at Port Campbell. And that would have been tough. That would have been a really hard life for him. He grew up and he got married, an only child. He had 9 children of his own. One of them is my dad, or was my dad. He then had 36 grandchildren, and I'm one of those. So I've got 30 cousins on one side and 15 cousins on the other. Anyone got more than 45 cousins? Yeah, there's a few. Okay. I can't say I keep in touch with them all. But so that's the story of his life. But I really only knew him as an older man after his wife had died. And he'd retired to Geelong. And I enjoyed going to see him. And the reason I enjoyed going to see him was that when you walked into his house, firstly, there was a sense of peace in his house. There was no background noise. I never remember a TV or a radio or anything else going. There was a peaceful setting there. And he would want to open the Bible with you. And he would say, let's have a look at what God's been saying to me today. And he'd open the Word and he'd share a verse with me. And then he'd say, and what's your verse you want to share with me? You had to be prepared because you knew he was going to ask that. So you had a verse ready. He prayed for his family every night. So you got the 9 children, the 36 grandchildren. It took him 2 hours to get through the list. And he had to stop and have a cup of tea halfway through. What was it about his life that appealed to me? It was his faith, his connection to God, his connection to Jesus Christ. And I wanted that in my life. And I would hope that if he was still here today, he would say, I can see that connection in your life too. Thanks, you can take the picture down. I just wonder whether, as I've been telling you that, if you can think of someone. Have you thought of someone? Just put your hand up if you've someone in your life who's had an impact on you. And hopefully they've had an impact that's led you to relationship with Jesus Christ, because that's the most important impact we can have on each other. So as we look at this relationship between Eli and Samuel, I want us to think about 3 things that Eli did for Samuel. Firstly, Eli nurtured Samuel. Secondly, Eli directed Samuel to God. And thirdly, Eli listened to Samuel. And there's a sermon outline in your newsletter if you want to follow along. So firstly, Eli nurtured Samuel. 1 Samuel 3, verse 1 to 3. The boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare. There were not many visions. One night, Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak that he could barely see, was lying down in his usual place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the house of the Lord where the ark of God was. So Samuel's asleep in the actual tent of God, and the Ark of the Covenant is right there, and his little bed, he's probably maybe 12 years old by this stage, is next to the Ark of the Covenant. Now that could be pretty scary, because we know that people who touched the Ark of the Covenant immediately died. So Samuel probably was careful, not to brush up against the Ark of the Covenant. But there would have been a real sense that God was in his presence, because the Ark of the Covenant represented God's presence for Israel. So here he is asleep in the house of God. And Eli has nurtured him and parented him and looked after him. And we read that Samuel was a man of God. Everyone needs to be nurtured. Every child needs to know that there is someone there for them, looking after them, protecting them, loving them, and nurturing them. We read this about Jesus in Matthew 19, verse 13 to 15. Then people brought little children to Jesus for him to place his hands on them and pray for them. But the disciples rebuked them. Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." When he had placed his hands on them, he went on from there. Jesus welcomed little children. In psychology, there's something that's been recognised that's called attachment theory. And it's about the need of babies in their first 6 to 12 months of life, the need for them to have a significant caregiver that they can look to and trust and know that person is there for them. And for babies who don't get that, they lack that sense of attachment. They lack that sense of security that we all need. And it affects them in later life. Now, the brain is an amazing thing, and it can find new neural pathways. So there is hope if that's been your experience. You can still find that sense of security that we all need. But the way God has naturally made us, we need significant caregivers in our life. And Samuel had Eli. And Hannah, Samuel's mother, trusted this old man to look after her son. And Eli nurtured Samuel. I wonder if you feel nurtured. I wonder if you were nurtured. I wonder if you're a good nurturer now to those who are younger than you. That's the great value of mentoring. It's the great value of a local church. Because when you look around here today, we've got a cross-section of ages. We've got babies and we've got people who are elderly. And there's not many places in the culture that we live in where you get that cross-section of ages. So there's an opportunity in a local church for the old to nurture the young. All it needs is for, I suppose, parents to give permission for their children to be given access to older people. And it needs older people to make the effort and to look out and to say, yeah, I'm old and, I might be losing my eyesight, I might be losing my mobility, I might be lacking energy, but I'm going to reach out and try to connect with some younger people. And so you can get surrogate grandparents within a church community. And it's a great privilege. And it can happen. And I know that it has happened and does happen in this church. We don't all have grandparents close by. We don't all have extended families. We don't all have children or grandchildren. But we have a church family that we can belong to and be involved in. And we can offer that nurture to one another. Eli nurtured Samuel. The second thing that Eli did for Samuel was he directed Samuel to God. 1 Samuel 3 verse 8 and 9 says this, and we have this story of Samuel lying down next to the ark of God, and he hears this voice, and the voice says, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel thinks it's Eli calling out. So he gets up and he goes to the old man and he says, what do you want? You called me. And Eli says, I didn't call you. And this happens twice. And so we pick it up in verse 8 and 9. A third time, the Lord called Samuel. And Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, here I am, you called me. Then Eli realised that the Lord was calling the boy. So Eli told Samuel, go and lie down. And if he calls you, say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. So Samuel went and lay down in his place. This is a critical moment in Samuel's development and a critical moment for Eli. Because Eli would have said to Samuel, okay, Samuel, It's God speaking. I'm a man of God. When he speaks to you, come and tell me what he says, and I'll interpret it, and I'll help you learn to relate to God. So what Eli could have done is, instead of directing Samuel to the vine, which is God or Jesus Christ for us, he could have said, I'm a big established branch. I know God. So what you need to do is attach yourself to me, and I will help you to know God. That wasn't going to help Samuel, because Eli wasn't around for much longer. His life was nearly over. And our job as Christian mentors is to direct those we're mentoring not to us, but to Jesus Christ. So Eli says to Samuel, that's God speaking to you. I'm not going to get between you and what God is saying to you. So you go back to your bed, and the next time you hear the voice, say, speak, Lord, I'm listening. And allow God to minister to you. God can minister to us at any age, and it is the responsibility of those of us who are older to direct those of us who are younger, not to us, but to Jesus. What's happening out there at Kids Alive at the moment, our Sunday school, is just so important, because those teachers, if they're doing their job well, are directing those children to Jesus. Not to themselves, but to Jesus. And when children are taught and learn about Jesus at a young age, it impacts their life. Proverbs 22 verse 6 says, start children off on the way they should go, and even when they are old, they will not turn from it. Eli directed Samuel to God. I wonder if you've ever had anyone in your life direct you to Jesus. I hope you have. It's probably one of the reasons you're here this morning. If you haven't, then allow me to direct you to Jesus this morning. You don't need anything more than that statement that says, speak, Lord, I'm listening. That's all it takes. Because God has created you to have a relationship with himself. And he's created you to have that relationship through Jesus Christ, not through any intermediary, any priest or any pastor, but you can come directly to the throne of God because of what Jesus Christ has done. So it's very important that those of us who are older direct those who are younger to Jesus. And that's what Eli did. So Eli nurtured Samuel. Secondly, Eli directed Samuel to God. Thirdly, Eli listened to Samuel. So God spoke to Samuel, and let's read what he said. Oh, well, we're not going to read what he said. We're going to read what Samuel did the next morning. Because the message that Samuel got from God was not a message that was going to be a pleasant message for Eli and his family, because it was a message of judgment because of the sin in Eli's sons. God was going to judge the family, and God was going to judge Eli, and God was going to judge his sons. So God tells this message to this 12-year-old boy to give to this 80-year-old priest. It's a tough message to give for a child to tell someone that old that what you've done is wrong and God is not happy with you. And Eli could easily have dismissed that message and said, oh, that wouldn't be God speaking. I don't want to hear that message. So what happened? 1 Samuel 3:15 to 18. Samuel lay down until morning and then opened the doors of the house of the Lord. He was afraid to tell Eli the vision. That's understandable. But Eli called him and said, Samuel, my son. Samuel answered, here I am. What was it he said to you? Eli asked. Do not hide it from me. May God deal with you, be it ever so severely, if you hide from me anything he told you. So Samuel told him everything, hiding nothing from him. Then Eli said, he is the Lord. Let him do what is good in his eyes. See, God had a message for Eli, and the message came through a child. And I think that's really important for those of us who are older Christians, to not dismiss those who are younger. To not think, well, what would they know? You know, I was brought up, children should be seen and not heard. And there's some truth in that. But children can hear from God, and they should be listened to. See, Samuel was preparing to be a prophet. And the job of a prophet is not easy. You deliver messages often that people don't want to hear. And this was training for Samuel. This was the first prophecy he had to deliver, and it was to the man who'd raised him, to this old man Eli. It wasn't easy for Samuel to deliver the message. It wasn't easy for Eli to hear it. But Eli listened to Samuel. In Matthew 21, 14 to 16, we read this. The blind and the lame came to him, that is Jesus, at the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and teachers of the law saw the wonderful things he did, and the children shouting in the temple courts, Hosanna to the Son of David, they were indignant. Do you hear what these children are saying? They asked him. Yes, replied Jesus. Have you never read, from the lips of children and infants, you, Lord, have called forth your praise? See, the children recognised Jesus as the Messiah. The religious leaders missed it. I think one of the strengths of Baptist doctrine, and I'm not here to say Baptists are right and every other denomination is wrong. Don't hear me say that. But one of the strengths of Baptist doctrine is the priesthood of all believers. And what that means is that any one of you can hear from God just as well as I can hear from God, or our elders can hear from God. And the challenge for those of us in leadership is to listen. So if you've got something to tell us, and it may be a rebuke, try and not be, too harsh on us, but it may be a rebuke. We want to listen to that, don't we, leaders? Don't we, leaders? Yeah, don't we, leaders? Okay. Because God wants us to grow. Jesus wants us to learn and mature and become more Christ-like. And that applies to everyone across the church, the leaders and the children. Just as the children are growing out there, hopefully we're growing in here right now. So Eli listened to Samuel, and I wonder if we're prepared to listen to our own children. I wonder if we're prepared to listen to our grandchildren. There was just some great dialogue in that show between the old people and the 4-year-olds, and I encourage you to watch more of it. And there was a connection that was spiritual between the old and the young, and that can happen for us. We're never too old to mentor those following us, and also people are never too old to be of value. So if we're young, value the old. If we're old, connect with the young. That's the message from today. Eli nurtured Samuel. Eli directed Samuel to God. Eli listened to Samuel. I love this verse from Psalm 92, these verses, and I know they were significant verses for my own father as he became old. It says this, the righteous will flourish like a palm tree. They will grow like a cedar of Lebanon, planted in the house of the Lord. They will flourish in the courts of our God. They will still bear fruit in old age. They will stay fresh and green, proclaiming, the Lord is upright. He is my rock, and there is no wickedness in him. They will stay fresh and green. They will still bear fruit in old age. This morning before church, and Phil prayed for Lawrence this morning, and I don't want to just highlight one person, but Lawrence is 84, I think. Is that right? Yeah, he's 84. His wife of 55 years passed away almost 5 years ago. Would have been very easy for Lawrence to sort of shut down, perhaps to shrivel and become perhaps inward looking. Lawrence arrived this morning with his tie on, and that's an indicator he's not staying here. Because if you look around, there's not too many ties here this morning. But he had his tie on because he's going to another church this morning to preach. And that church is a church where they wear ties, and that's fine. I'm not saying wearing ties is right. I'm not saying not wearing ties is right. I'm just saying there's difference, okay? So he's off driving half an hour away, preaching to people. He does it most weeks. And that's only one small example of him flourishing in old age. I think our oldest person here this morning, and I won't embarrass her, I said, "How are you this morning?" She's over 90, and she said, "Look, I'm okay. I'm up. I've got a house to live in. I've got a fire to sit by. I've got a bed to sleep in, and I'm able to get up and go to church. I'm grateful for that." She's flourishing in old age. She's flourishing. There's so much that we can learn from those older than us. There's so much that we can learn from those younger than us. And the culture that we live in isolates these age groups from each other. And that's a real shame. And as a church, we can stop that from happening. And we can encourage connection and interaction. I wonder how you would have coped if you were Eli. I wonder how you would have coped if you were Samuel. I wonder how you would have coped if you were Hannah, Samuel's mum. She made this vow to God, "I will give my child to God." She arrives to hand her son over at the house of God, and here's this old guy who can barely get out of his chair and he can hardly see, and he says, "Where is he? Who is he? Okay, bring him in here." And she's thinking, "Ooh, I can't leave my little boy with him." But she trusted God. Now, I'm not saying that, you send your kids off to live with old people. I'm not saying that. I know that's probably a temptation for some of you. What I'm saying is just give them some connection. It's the way God intended it to be. Amen.